Okay, we are turning now this week to a new subject, actually the real subject of theology. We are leaving behind for now prolegomena, the preliminary stuff, and we're turning to what is called theology proper, the science and the study of God. So as we think about God, trying to work this through somewhat logically, the question is, what can we say? Well, to start, we are assuming, believing that God exists. How do we believe that God exists? Well, we're going to look at a couple different ways here, but for Christians, part of that is going to be the biblical record. We believe that God has revealed himself to us. We have the conviction of our own faith, and connected to that, then we have the testimony of the Holy Spirit with us. There are other reasons and other ways that we can argue for God's existence, and we're going to look at some of those here in a moment. But at some level, these are going to play a part of things. We also want to be aware that to affirm God's existence is a statement of faith. It's not something that can be argued exhaustively so that it's the only possible conclusion. And as we turn now to some arguments for God's existence, I don't think any of them will get any person to the point of saying, oh, I was an atheist before, but now that I know that, it's so obvious God exists. They don't work that way. But if you have enough rational arguments of God's existence, a person can, in a court, be convicted on enough circumstantial evidence. And I think that the circumstantial evidence does point significantly in the direction of God's existence. So we're going to spend some time unpacking arguments for God's existence as we think about this first statement of faith that God actually exists. So the first one we will look at is from Anselm. It's about 1100, thereabouts, about 1095. We will look at two arguments from Thomas Aquinas. One's called the cosmological argument, and one's called the teleological argument. And then we'll look at what's sometimes referred to as the anthropological argument or the moral argument, and that's going to come to us from Immanuel Kant. So let's look at these together. The first is what's called the ontological argument. Now, that's a big fancy term. Ontology just refers to being. So I have ontology to myself. There's some kind of essence. There's something to my being. So when we're talking about the ontological argument, we're talking about God and God's essence in actuality. So the argument goes like this: God's existence is actually required by the idea of God. How does Anselm make that argument? He starts with the idea that God is the greatest conceivable being. The technical phrase he uses is, he is that which nothing greater can be thought. God, by definition, is that which nothing greater can be thought. He's the greatest conceivable being ever. That which nothing greater can be thought. That's God. Second premise, though, in a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists theoretically. So God is that which nothing greater can be thought, by definition, Anselm says, and it is greater to exist than to not exist. So, to be the greatest of all possible things, God must therefore necessarily exist. So says Anselm. Now, I'm not saying that you should be kind of amazed by that, but that is the way this argument goes. It's simple. It is it's interesting in that we it's one of those things where you look at it and you kind of say, we know there's a problem here, but we're not quite sure where it is. So this is Anselm's argument. He says God is that which nothing greater can be thought. It's greater to exist than to not exist. And therefore God must necessarily exist for him to be who he is, which is that which nothing greater can be thought. Now, there's a certain cyclical nature to this argumentation. Like I said, it holds in some way, but you can also actually use this argument to argue for the non-existence of Satan, for example. So you could say Satan is the greatest of all non-beings, or the least being, because he'd be the exact opposite of God. The least existing being, or something like that. And then premise 2 would be it is worse to not exist than to exist. So if Satan is the lowest being, he must by necessity not exist. That kind of reveals the difficulty of this argument and why it doesn't really work. Why almost I can't imagine anyone coming to faith in Christ as a result of it. Let's go on to the first of two. So Aquinas actually made 5 arguments for the existence of God. He wasn't convinced by Anselm. He made 5 arguments. The first 4 taken together are really the cosmological argument. So the best way to keep your mind straight on this, even though this is cosmological, as in the cosmos, I would be thinking about cosmological as in C-A-U-S-E. So one of the arguments that Aquinas makes is the argument on the basis of motion. I'm not going to worry about that. But in a very similar way, he makes the same thing about causes. In our world, we see that one thing causes another. That's the way it goes. Something must have started the chain of causes, Aquinas argues. You can't have, he would say, what's called an infinite regress. You can't go back forever. You eventually, somewhere along the line, you have to have a beginning cause. So for that reason, God is the uncaused cause who started the whole chain of causation in the universe. Now, this is another one of those things where he's kind of say, well, there's something there, but I don't know that it gets me to home plate or not. I know atheists like to make the issue here that, well, if God created the world, well, who created God? I mean, that's essentially the refutation of the cosmological argument. But their position isn't actually as kind of cute as they think it is. So we have the cosmological argument, and they come back and say, well, who caused God? And they think that refutes this. Well, let's take their premise for a minute. There is no God. The universe caused people, things to exist. The universe is the cause. Well, by their own argument, then who or what caused the universe? See, they can't escape this infinite regress either. The only way you get out of this cycle is to say there has to be a completely necessary being that is not contingent. And we'll talk about contingency later. But this is an interesting argument. So we have these chains of causes. Everything is caused by something else. Something has to have started this chain of cause and effect. So think cosmological argument, the cosmos, but it's really about C-A-U-S-E, cause. Now the other argument that he makes, the 5th argument he makes, it's also, I should have said here, it's also the unmoved mover. So the first of the 4 arguments that make up the cosmological argument is called the principle of motion, or the argument from motion. And so we see things in motion. Well, something has to have started them in motion. You have to go back far enough. Someone had to be the first thing that started everything else moving. So it's a very similar kind of thing, but it's based on motion, not cause and effect. So God could be the unmoved mover or the uncaused cause. So looking now then at the teleological argument, again by Aquinas, the universe demonstrates purposeful order. Purpose requires intelligence. This is, in essence, the watchmaker argument. If you're walking along a beach and you find a pocket watch or a wristwatch laying there, it is so intricate. There are so many moving pieces. You know that it was designed for a purpose, but the intricacy of it and its purposefulness requires you to believe that there's an intelligence behind it. It is impossible to think that it happened there by itself. And Aquinas would say that is what we're talking about with creation. I think we've mentioned before in other recordings, telos is the goal of something, but it's connected to its creation. So this is essentially the argument from design. People who want to make an intelligent design argument are really doing a teleological argument for God's existence. Again, we have the watchmaker analogy here. If you encounter a watch on the beach, you have to assume that it had a maker. And this argument says similarly that we must assume that you take how complex a watch is, and the world is exponentially much more complex. So if you'd have to think about that as a watch, how much more do you have to conclude that for the world, the creation, the universe? The last one that we'll look at here is Kant's moral argument. And his position is that we all have a moral sense of right and wrong. We also sense that we have a moral imperative. There are things that we feel like we ought to do or ought not to do. And that this moral sense, this moral imperative, this duty that we have, often isn't rewarded in this life. And so Kant would argue that that moral sense has to have come from somewhere, and that unresolved reward and punishment kind of thing, that has to be corrected in some way sometime. So even if it's in the afterlife, justice must prevail, right must be able to win, wrong must be set in its place or punished in some way. And so all of this, Kant said, points to God's existence. Now, one of the difficulties is that it isn't like, well, there's no guarantee that we're talking about the Christian God. So even if you take all of these arguments and say, absolutely, by the end of the day, there has to be a God, well, there doesn't have to be a Christian God. There just has to be a God. So this can only really take us so far in the journey. Kant here says the imperative must come from someone and must be rewarded even if it's in the afterlife. So, are you convinced by this? I'd be surprised if you are. If you're totally convinced, maybe it helps support your faith. There's a great philosopher named Peter Kreeft, P-E-T-E-R is his first name, K-R-E-E-F-T. It looks like Kreeft, but he pronounces it Kreeft. He is a Roman Catholic, teaches philosophy at Boston College, and he has a book where I think he has like 20 different arguments for the existence of God, which is an interesting way. It's one, again, I think he thinks he can get closer, or makes an exhaustive claim. I think he gets closer than he thinks he gets closer than I think he does. But I am persuaded somewhat by the weight of evidence. So that if you can muster 20 different decent arguments for God's existence, well, then maybe there are things in life that are pointing very suggestively towards God's existence. So I want to turn to some other kind of arguments about God's existence. Now, these next quotes are going to be about science. So we often pit science against religion or faith. I think that's a mistake to begin with. But I want to show you some quotes that are true about mathematics and science, that if we tried to say these things about faith, people would laugh at us. They would say that is not evidence at all. But let's look at some of these arguments together. So this is from James Watson, who's a Nobel Prize winner. he's talking about DNA, and he said a structure this pretty just had to exist. So he comes upon this molecular structure of DNA, and he finds this has an intrinsic beauty to it, and because of its beauty, it absolutely had to exist. Why does beauty necessitate existence? But somehow this is a perfectly legitimate thing to say in science. Not sure that if we said a being so beautiful, i.e. God or Jesus on the cross for us, or a being that beautiful just has to exist. Not sure we'd be allowed to say it, but this is Richard Feynman. He says, you can recognize truth by its beauty and simplicity. Really? So if we could demonstrate Christianity to be beautiful and simple, then would it be true? Supposedly that is true for some forms of science, but it should, I think, hold for religion too. Werner Heisenberg, he wrote that the truth of his theory was immediately found convincing by virtue of its completeness and abstract beauty. I'm not sure. I'm thinking he did work on string theory. I don't remember right now. But his theory was found convincing because it was complete and because it had this abstract beauty to it. Steven Weinberger, I would find it hard to believe that this much elegance and mathematical beauty would be wasted. And he's right. That guy is certainly writing about string theory. All of this mathematical beauty would be wasted. That's why string theory must hold, because of this elegance and beauty. All right, but it would seem that if you can make those kind of arguments in math and science, then those kind of arguments ought to be at least admitted in some way for things like faith and religion. So we'll pause here, and then we're going to pick back up talking about the nature of God himself beyond his existence, looking specifically at his attributes.